Hello and welcome to Spring Office Hours, Season 3, Episode 19, What's New in Observability. My name is Dan Vega, Spring Developer Advocate with Broadcom, and today I am joined by two special guests, Jonatan Ivanov and Tommy Ludwig. Gentlemen, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good.
It is odd hours for everyone. We are streaming at a pretty odd time this morning, at least this morning here in the States. Jonatan is in Seattle, so it's very early for him. And Tommy is in Tokyo, so it's very late for him. So we had to try to find a good time for everyone. And this is what we came up with. So we are excited about this episode. We thank all of you for joining us. Jonatan, for the people out there who may not know you, even though you're basically a Spring Office Hours member at this point because you are joining the live streams every week, answering questions. But for those who don't know you, can you just give us a little intro?
Yeah, I am the one who are making trouble in the one of them who are making trouble in the comments. Yes. So hi, I'm Jonatan. I am like 1/3 of the Spring Observability team. I work in the Spring engineering team, usually on Micrometer, but sometimes on other projects as well, like Spring Cloud related things and Spring Boot as well. And I am also one of the leaders of the Seattle Java user group.
Awesome. Tommy?
Yeah, so I'm glad to be here. I think it's my first time on Spring Office Hours. But so I also work on the observability team with Jonatan. So working on the Spring team, doing observability related stuff around Spring projects, and most of the time focusing on Micrometer, which is the library that's kind of underpinning all of the observability in the Spring ecosystem, and as well outside of the Spring ecosystem as well.
That's awesome. One of my questions today was going to be like the most important question was going to be, how do you pronounce it? Because I always say, like, I most of the time say micrometer, but there are certain times where I think I get stuck and then I just say micrometer. And I hear people say it both different ways, but since you just pronounced it micrometer, I think that's the official way. I'm going to stick with that. And one of my important questions is out of the way.
I will say that is the official pronunciation, but nobody is going to throw tomatoes at anyone if they pronounce it however they want.
All right, cool.
And I believe I like pronounce it the wrong way most of the times.
Okay. I have said it both ways a ton of different times. So yeah, it is what it is, I guess. Cool. So if you are joining us in the live stream, thanks again for joining us. We see we have a bunch of visitors here today. That's awesome. Please do me a favor and get your questions in. We have two people with extensive knowledge of observability, so it's a really good time to get your questions in. If not, if you want to, you can catch this on a replay on YouTube on the Spring Developer channel, and you can get this wherever you get your podcasts. So quick agenda for today. I want to talk about your Spring I/O workshop, your Spring I/O session. We've been doing a lot of intros to what's coming in Spring I/O over the last month. We talked to Sergey last week. We talked to a couple different speakers just to get everybody really excited about next week. I know we were talking before the show. We're all really excited to be there and kind of see one another. But we'll get into that. And then if we have some time, I want to get into the release notes for Spring Boot 3.3. That's coming quickly next week, I believe. Is it next week or this week? This week, right?
This week.
This
should be on Thursday.
Thursday, yep. So yeah, that's coming quickly. So get a little bit of a preview of some of the features that are coming. Because again, I like to look through the release notes and look at the features at a high level, and then we can kind of like talk through them. So we'll see if we have some time for that. So I figured a good place to get started was at Spring Boot 3.0. When Spring Boot 3.0 came out, there were like 4 major things. We're talking about Java 17, the change to Jakarta, AOT was a huge theme, and observability was a huge theme. And I know I've talked to different members on the Spring team, and they said any one of those could have been like the one thing that we worked on in that release, but we took on 4 of those. So that was whenever I talk about Spring Boot 3.0, I always mention that, because that to me is like just awesome that you guys were able to get all of those things out. So observability was the main theme, and I wanted to just talk about like kind of the origins of that. Like, as a team, you kind of stepped back and said, we need to make some major changes here, and just get your thoughts on like how that started and why we went about that in Spring Boot 3.0.
Mhm. I think one of the main drivers of the whole thing was introducing the observation API in Micrometer.
Mhm.
And as far as I remember, like it was like in like Boot 3.0, it was released like 1.5 years ago, I guess. And the observation API, we started working on it like 3 years ago.
Wow.
So it took quite a time. As far as I remember, I pitched the idea to Tommy and Marcin to have like one single tool set that you can use to instrument your application. And you can basically decide later if you want like getting like metrics data out of that instrumentation, or distributed tracing, logging, or like whatever you want. And I believe after that, like we started working on it, and we iterated a lot over on it. I remember like at least like 5 to 6 versions that we have of
Wow.
the same thing.
So prior to Spring Boot 3.0, there was no API that consistently the framework was using and that developers could use to hook into all of this, right?
There were multiple APIs.
Right.
Yeah,
And so
kind of,
now,
if you look at it from a dependency perspective,
yep.
Prior to Spring Boot 3, Spring Boot 2 used Micrometer as a dependency and offered instrumentation of things like Spring Web MVC, Spring Web Flux, the REST client, those kinds of things. And so all of that observability instrumentation was in Boot. And from a user's perspective, that was mostly fine. But the problem was each of the individual projects couldn't have their own instrumentation. And so the instrumentation had to be farther away from the project. And maybe you didn't have all of the information exposed that you wanted exposed to Boot, and that project didn't want to open up that information because it's really more of something that shouldn't be part of the API for users, but you want it to be part of the observability instrumentation information that you have there.
Right.
So part of the purpose was to allow the projects to be able to directly instrument by depending on Micrometer. And we needed to do something so that we could do that, hopefully not multiple times, with metrics and tracing and anything else that might come up in the future. And we already had this existing project called Spring Cloud Sleuth, which was very successful and widely used. But as the first 2 words of that hint, it's a Spring Cloud project.
Yeah.
And so Spring Framework and anything that's not in the Spring Cloud umbrella can't really depend on that, because it's depending on all of them. So we had to figure out how to break this, how to get things in the hands of the individual projects without creating a circular dependency. And that was another big motivation behind. We wanted to get the observability instrumentation closer to the projects so that we could get the best observability instrumentation available and avoid any kind of dependency nightmare.
Yeah, and I think like Sleuth, also what Tommy mentioned, it also had the same issue. Like Boot was instrumenting projects kind of like outside. Sleuth was like, if I can say that, even worse from that perspective, because it was like even like further from the instrumented project, a little bit further, because it like needed to depend on Boot and so on. So one big theme in Spring Boot 3 was basically moving these instrumentation pieces into the various projects. So the instrumentation for MVC, it goes to MVC. The instrumentation for Spring Kafka, it goes to Spring Kafka.
Yep.
Makes sense.
Yep. And I think, that was when Spring Boot 3.0 came out. I think one of the major key points that we kept kind of telling everyone was there's a huge observability change in 3.0, but this is really going to continue on in the 3.x line. This was like the start of it. This wasn't the finish, right? And I think we saw that in every release. As we'll look at 3.3 today, there's more observability improvements there. And one of the big things I see is, like you said, all the individual projects, every time they have new releases, I see observability features there. So
Yes.
that probably wasn't the case before 3.0. And now every single project, like I'm a big fan of Spring for GraphQL. Every time that comes out, I see like observability changes there. So as you said, it's kind of putting the onus on the project now instead of relying on just the overall framework to handle everything for you.
Yes.
So-
Yeah, and we think there are a lot of benefits to that because
Yeah.
we on the observability team can't be experts in every single other project.
Yeah.
And so you mentioned like Spring GraphQL. I'm not a GraphQL expert. It maybe advise on the observability instrumentation for Spring GraphQL, but really you want somebody who's the expert of that project saying this is what makes sense to be in the observability instrumentation or this doesn't make sense to be in there. And them being able to make that call and them getting the feedback directly from their users rather than us getting feedback from Spring GraphQL users of like, oh, there's something wrong with the observability data. And then we don't know, does it make sense to change it that way? Does it not make sense? And so having it closer means that you can get that tighter feedback loop and also when new features get added to a project, then it's more front of mind of, oh, I'm adding this new feature. It would really help users if there was observability for this from the beginning. And then they're kind of thinking about observability when they're making features and not after the fact when users are asking for it.
Yes.
Yep.
And also you can have like access to more or better quality data. Like what you cannot access from the outside, you usually can access from the inside. Like if you cannot, then you can just make a change for that for yourself. So compatibility is less of an issue usually. We don't need to maintain that, hey, this version of Micrometer is compatible with that version of GraphQL.
Cool. So we're coming close to 3.3. As I said, this is going to be like a theme in kind of all the 3.x lines. And all the different projects out there. How do you feel it's going since 3.0? Things going good? Where are we at? Like, is this going to continue to be a theme as we go forward?
I think so. Like, if you, for example, look into the release notes since 3.0, like 3.1, 3.2, and now like 3.3, all of them contained a lot of changes for observability. Like every single release in boot, there were a lot of things around the observability team. They actually eventually have a issue team just for observability.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. Is a lot of this been driven by like things you guys had in mind, or are you getting a lot of feedback from the community and kind of driving changes that way?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I think what we were most excited about in doing this was getting each of the project teams to think about it and come up with things that we would have never thought of. Because as we said, we're not the experts, they're the experts. But also the users too are coming in with ideas that we wouldn't have thought of. And particularly with this observation API, it's been out there, but we haven't been maybe advertising as much because it's very kind of like, if you're writing instrumentation, it's what you would want to use, but maybe a lot of users aren't writing observability instrumentation. They're just using the data that it outputs. But this new observation API, and I think we'll talk more about it later, but we're excited at what users are going to end up doing with that, what observation handlers they're going to write that we didn't think of. I mean, we have default implementations for metrics and tracing, and you could easily imagine a logging one, but we're really excited to see what the community eventually comes up with in terms of something that we weren't even thinking of, or something that's really unique that ties things together, maybe that's specific to their environment that they're working in.
Cool.
I think maybe it is like not even two faults, like the Spring team and the community, but maybe like three. So we did have instrumentation before. So there are like concepts there which we can decide, hey, should we implement this or not? Like, should we basically like propagate this over to the new word? And also basically like having these concepts there or not, or like improve them in a way. For example, we kind of like backward compatible, like the instrumentation in boot 3, the output of it is kind of backward compatible what was there in boot 2.
Cool. Okay, I have a couple questions. We'll get into the Spring IO talks in a second, but I have one question here from the live stream. I am using Spring Boot Observability, boot version 3.2.x. Sometimes the trace ID and span IDs generated are all zeros. Any idea why?
I think I can use like my fortune teller
Your
skills.
best guess.
And I guess you are using OpenTelemetry, the OpenTelemetry bridge under the hood. And the all zeros, trace ID and span ID, those are called like invalid span in OTel. And as far as I know, you can get it if you don't have a parent span. So every root span, it can have these all zeros. And I guess also depending on if you are using or how you are using it, maybe you can also get it if the span is not sampled. But we just had an issue last week about on a similar thing. So maybe we can improve on this. But all zero span is not a problem. It's a natural thing in OpenTelemetry. Cool. If you see it with Brave, that's where I would start freaking out.
Cool. All right. Thank you for that. I have one more here from our good friend Simon. I have a question for Jonatan, since he seems to be the perfect person to ask. Spring Boot 3.3 adds the process info contributor. Have you seen any interesting custom implementations yet?
Yes, that was my pull request. So there is
Nice.
a new info contributor in 3.3 called process info contributor, which can give you like process related information, like the PID. I don't even remember what was in there, but I'm not sure what you mean, Simon, on like custom implementation. I want to add more things to it because as far as I remember right now, it contains like the CPU info, like how many available processors you have, because that can be interesting if you are in a containerized environment, because you might have like less processors than the host. Usually that's the case. And also you can get into interesting cases with Kubernetes when that number that the JVM calculates as available processor count is 1, because that can have consequences, like the single-threaded GC will be picked, like the serial GC, there will be only one G thread, one GC threads, and so on. A bunch of things can happen. So I also want to add memory-related information to that. But other than that, I don't really know any like custom implementation of that.
Cool. All right. Thanks for that. Again, keep getting your questions in. We'll see if we can't get to them. And I think what I want to do now is head over to here. Where are we at? There we are. So we've been talking.
One thing just came to my mind to Simon's question. Tommy, do you happen to know what is the name of the library for Java hardware-related things? It is OSHI?
Yes.
OSHI. Simon, take a look at that.
Yes.
Cool. He made another comment here. For now, it only contains the process info and exposes basic processor info. And I was thinking of custom contributor to add extra info.
Oh, yes. So if you go to the Spring Boot issue tracker, there is a issue opened by me called Enhanced Observability, I think, that contains all of those like info contributors I added so far, and I am planning to add to boot. Nice. So yeah, take a look at those. Those should be coming. If you want to implement one of them, just go ahead and open a PR.
Cool.
Yeah, we would love to hear more from users out there of what would be useful for them, what kind of situations are they looking for this information in, so that we have the full context and then we can understand what is the benefit of it. Because we always have to prioritize work and understand the context of something, because we can't add everything to boot, because we have to think about the benefit for all of the users and how custom a need is to a specific user versus how generally useful it is. So if you have ideas, please share them if you want to. If you have a pull request that you could put together and explain all of that, that would be great.
Cool. All right. So I want to get into some Spring IO. We were talking about before the show, but we have been kind of leading up to this over the last month. We talked to a few different speakers. We talked to Sergey last week about kind of planning and putting together Spring IO. I've actually never been to Spring IO. I've been to Barcelona last year. I was in Barcelona with Jonatan for VMware Explore, but I've never been to Spring IO. So are you guys Spring IO veterans? How many times you've been here? I got to imagine you've been there more than me. So
I have been there, let's say 4 or 5 times maybe now.
Wow. All right. You're the vet.
It's an amazing conference. I absolutely love it. I would highly recommend it to any Spring developer.
Cool. Yeah. And I said, oh, go ahead, Jonatan.
Yeah, for me, this might be shocking. This will be my first.
Wow. All right.
Yep.
Well, we're both rookies. That makes me feel better. Yeah, we were, we were there in November in Barcelona. Much better weather in May, so I'm really looking forward to that. So that should be fun. And for me, we were talking about before the show, I go to a lot of the same conferences here in the States, so I end up seeing a lot of the same people at different conferences. I'm really excited to be in Barcelona, where I know a lot of my friends that I've talked to online for so many years now don't usually make the trip to America, and I don't usually make the trip to EMEA. So I'm really excited to see so many people for the first time ever. So including you, Tommy. So this is going to be a lot of fun. I'm excited about this conference, and I can't believe it's next week. This has really snuck up on us.
I can't believe it either. It's happens every year. It sneaks up on you. But before we get into the workshop, I was wondering how many people we have watching right now that are going to Spring IO next week.
Great question.
Even if you're not going, how many people would like to go? People want to leave a comment in the chat, maybe.
Yeah, let us know if you're going. Let us know where you're coming from to attend. I know one of the things Sergey highlighted was just the amount of people coming from different areas. I want to say, I'd have to go back and watch a replay, but I believe he said it was like 147 different countries were going to be represented at Spring IO, which is so cool. That was awesome to hear. So, okay, so you guys are going to be there a day before me because you guys have a workshop diving into observability with Micrometer. I got it right this time. And Spring Boot 3. So at a high level, can you just talk about how long is this workshop and what do you really want to try to cover in this workshop?
It is 8 long hours.
Wow, that is a long. It is, I will say before you get into this though, before you like run a workshop, whether it's 4 hours or 8 hours, before the first time you do that, it seems daunting. It seems like, it takes forever to put together an hour presentation. How am I ever going to put together an 8-hour workshop? But when you get into the crux of a workshop and it's like walking around, helping people, really doing some exploration of code together, that runs a while. So yes, it's still a lot of hard work. I'm not discounting that. But with the two of you and your knowledge, I think some of the times it kind of flies by. Do you disagree?
I think, Jonathan's been doing a number of workshops in the past year or two, right?
Yes. I can tell that like it is not even the first time. Like the second and the third time, it's still like a lot of work because you need to modify things and keep them up to date. But I believe the most like time consuming is like when you want to like time certain parts of the workshop. Like if you want to like time an 8-hour workshop like twice, that's at least like 16 hours.
That's true.
That's a lot. Yes.
Yep. Do you time the whole thing as one workshop, or do you like split it up into sections and say, well, today let's practice this particular 2-hour chunk?
So for this one, we haven't like timed it, but the previous workshops, I am doing it in chunks. Like there is no way like you can do like an 8. Yeah, it's a lot. Well, actually, it's like doable. For example, Venkat was doing like a one-man show, but he's a robot, so he doesn't count.
He is a different animal. We can't even count Venkat. He's on like another planet. All right. Well, if you need filler, I will bring ChatGPT in and tell dad jokes. So please let me know. So kind of back to the workshop. It says here, are you frequently wondering about your application is doing in production? Could performance bottlenecks, work unseen, and errors leave you scrambling in the dark? It's time to shine a light. This hands-on workshop dives into the power of application observability using Micrometer and Spring Boot 3, empowering you to gain deep insights into your applications. So 8 hours to kind of cover some of this stuff. I got to imagine there are a lot, maybe not large organizations, but I got to imagine there's a lot of people who build an application and just kind of get it out there into production. That's their first priority. Then it's like, oh, wait, we have to know what's going on in production. So maybe there's some people thinking about it before it goes to production, but there might be people thinking about it after it goes to production. When somebody comes to you and says, like, what do we do? What's kind of your first advice for them?
Well, so I think one of the nice things is, which is what we've covered in past talks. So like the talk that me and Marcin, the other teammate of ours on the Spring Observability team, we did a talk at Spring I/O last year that kind of covered the basics and demoed observability with Micrometer and Spring Boot 3. And so in that talk, kind of the gist of it all is, here's what observability is, here's what it's for, and you get so much of that out of the box without doing anything if you're using Spring Boot 3, and you just add some dependencies to your class path, and then you have the backends to store that information. You don't really need to do anything in your application per se, and that's kind of one of the big benefits of Spring Boot's auto configuration and having all of this instrumentation in each of the projects. So you get a lot without having to do anything. Of course, you do need those backends, and you do need to configure to send stuff to those backends.
Yep.
But I think that's the first key point, is that don't worry too much. You don't have to build everything from scratch. There's a lot of instrumentation already there available for you to use.
Yeah, and that's why I usually tell everyone my two go-to dependencies that I include in every single project are the Spring Boot DevTools and the Spring Boot Actuator. Those are two great things to have. Yep. Everything else can you can always add something else later, but those are two good starters to get with.
And I believe we kind of like simulate that scenario like during the workshop. Like we will have a sample application that already exists. And we can say that, hey, like right now this is deployed in production. Let's add observability. And as Tommy said, like you need to have some backends you can have the data in. But I believe like configuring or like bringing up those backends, like maybe it is more work than adding observability to your application, because like the observability part for Spring Boot, it's like just if you want like metrics and distributed tracing, I guess you can get away with like 3 dependencies, 4 maybe, plus like a few lines of like properties.
Cool. Yeah. So some of the other things that you kind of highlight in here is how Micrometer provides a unified API to instrument your code for various signals and backend. We talked about that earlier. And I kind of echo this because I saw you say this, I think, a year or two ago. And anytime I talk about observability, when I talk about Spring Boot 3, I say probably the most important piece of this was the observation API and just kind of how to use it. And some of the new things that have come along, like being able to just use the add observed annotation. I think that's really helped. Like, hey, I don't want to kind of convolute my code or add a whole bunch of verbosity in there, right? Like I can just add this annotation. So I guess another good place to start is, do you find that when you're talking about observability, some people, and this is, I'm saying some people because this was me, a few years ago, when I think of observability, like I would think of just logging. Like I just throw a bunch of log statements in my code. And so if somebody's been there and somebody just does a bunch of logging in their application, what's your advice to them? Like, what's kind of the next step to kind of getting more information out of observability?
So I think that is the typical developer, is that logs are basically the beginning and the end of the tool set for how do I debug what's happening in production.
Yep.
And that's fair because logs are very ubiquitous. Like, it's all of the libraries that you use have logging. Logging's just there out of the box. You can start up an application. You can look at the logs. You don't need a metrics backend. You don't need a tracing backend. You can look at the logs. Of course, if you're actually doing this in production, you need to somehow get logs, hopefully to some central location where you can search the logs. But still, yeah, I think it's very, very typical. But then the problems come down to, so you have multiple instances of your application in production, and then you have high traffic, and so you have a lot of logs going by. And so how do you pick out the right log to figure out what's going on? If a user, how do you even detect an issue in the first place? Are you going to send an alert to somebody for every error log that comes out? I've worked at a place where that's happened, and your email inbox very quickly gets crazy. And so that's not great. But then if you get past that and you somehow know that there's an issue happening in production, now you want to go check the logs. Maybe you have 1,000 logs in 1 second. How are you going to manage to look through that and find the one that corresponds to the issue that you were being told about? Like, it's kind of a nightmare scenario. And then even if somebody reports an issue to you, how do you put that in context of, okay, did this one person have this one-off issue, like we just had a hiccup with the network or something, and now everything's back to normal? Maybe there's not really a problem to look into, but you don't know because you'd have to look at the logs, and you'd have to look at all of the logs to know the full context. And if you have thousands of logs per second, that's not a feasible task for any developer to do. Plus, so this is where you want to go beyond that. And if you have metrics, then you can have aggregated data that gives you the context of, okay, this person's saying that they got an error, and I can see, yes, okay, we're consistently getting 2 errors per second or 5 errors per second versus an overall 100 requests per second. So I can contextualize that and say, okay, I'm getting a certain percentage of errors consistently. It's not just this one user. It's consistently happening. Or some users complaining about something being slow. Well, what is slow? Slow is relative, right? So you got to know, well, what's the slowest thing in my system? So where is this compared to that? And you need to...
And you said a really important word there, context. And I know Jonatan said this over the years. Something that always kind of struck me is like, okay, logs are going to kind of tell you what's happening in your application, but metrics give you that context. Like, what is slow? You're saying it's running 300 milliseconds, but how do you know that's slow unless you have some data on that? Like, all of our calls are 50 milliseconds, and this one is 300 milliseconds. Or, hey, 300 milliseconds, did it happen once or 150 times? Like, you have to have that context to actually understand what's going on. And I think that was the biggest aha moment for me, that like, yes, logs are great, but logs are really incomplete without that context.
Yeah. Plus, if you want to like do this, for example, that scenario with logs, it's kind of doable. Like, you can have like some amount of observability with just logs. But as Tommy mentioned, you will get into issues, and it will also get very expensive very quickly.
Yeah, that's always another problem with observability is cost. You can aggregate logs, but do you want to have to output a request that says or a log that says how long every request was, whether it was successful or an error, and then aggregate all those logs? Whereas if you just had metrics, it's one data point per time that you're exporting, which by default we export every minute. So one data point per minute. Or do you want, if you have 1,000 requests, do you want to have 1,000 log lines per second? Say if you have 1,000 requests per second, it's a big difference in cost there.
And then I see one of the kind of highlights of this workshop, how to integrate metrics with distributed tracing in logs. How does that kind of work?
So the basic idea there is that you can jump between these signals, like between logs and tracing with metrics, kind of like back and forth. And in order to do that, you need to use like at least like 3 concepts. And we are going to like show this and implement this in like during the workshop. And the basic idea here is that if you implement like distributed tracing, then with micrometer tracing and with the auto configuration of Spring Boot, you will get log correlation out of the box. And log correlation is basically like putting the trace ID and the span ID, like the tracing information, into the logs.
Oh, nice.
So because every single log line will have an information of, hey, like I am under the scope of this span or like this basic operation that is right now observed, you can use that trace ID to go from logs and the trace, because you just copy paste that trace ID and search for it in your distributed tracing backend.
Yeah.
And you can do the other way as well. Like you can search like that trace ID in your logs. So that's how you can jump between those two.
I have to imagine in the kind of the world that we're living in now, with microservices everywhere and organizations with hundreds of different services talking to each other, this has to be critical. Like if you don't have this, you're just not going to know what's going on in there.
Yes.
Cool.
I think that's one of the big criticisms of the whole microservice movement, right? Is, okay, well, now I have that many more applications and that many more instances. Well, now how do I understand what's happening with all these things now that it's all in different places and there's so much more of it? And that's where, observability becomes very critical.
Yeah.
And this particular feature is like, it's kind of magical, or it was like for me, like even if you don't have, for example, like a distributed tracing backend and you only have logs, but you like turn on like distributed tracing without exporting the data to a distributed tracing backend, for example, like Zipkin, and you only have like log correlation, like searching for that particular trace ID and looking at all of the log entries for all of the different applications for that one operation that basically like triggered everything and they belong together, that's very, very powerful. So even if you don't have a distributed tracing backend, like just like try to turn on like log correlation with distributed tracing capabilities and Spring Boot. It is pretty good and it's worth it.
I think that's a very good point. That's great for developers who are really familiar with logs and are comfortable with logs, because this makes logs so much more useful. Because in the scenario that I mentioned before, if you've got 1,000 requests per second and you've got a bunch of different applications and those requests are being handled in a multi-threaded way, so you have logs interleaving. So you have like one log line from request A, and then you have another log line from request B, and then a log line again. So if you're just looking at the logs in chronological order, you're going to be looking at logs from different requests together. And that's not usually particularly helpful. You want to see like a chronological order of, okay, I received this request from this user. What was logged in all of the applications that handled this user's requests? Right. And if you have that contextual information from tracing in your logs, even if you don't have the tracing data in a backend, Jonathan said, you can look at all of the logs for one request from a user.
Cool. I wanted to highlight something. I've seen everybody kind of from the observability team using some form of this demo in some presentations over the last maybe year, and it's been really good. So there's a tea house demo. I'll go ahead and share out the link. But I thought this was just a really good example of like different services talking to each other and all the different kind of features of observability. So if you want an application to play with, I think this is a really good start. And obviously, watch one of the recordings from Johnny, from Jonathan, from Tommy. That usually kind of goes over this thing. So really good place to start with that. So that's the workshop. That's going to be on Wednesday, and then the conference is Thursday and Friday of next week. And you guys have a session. I believe you guys are on Friday morning or Friday after lunch, I think. I think that's right.
Friday after lunch, I believe.
Unleash advanced observability in your JVM apps. So is this going to be a condensed version of the workshop, or is this a little bit different? What are you planning to cover in this session?
I think it'll have a lot of the same stuff that is from the workshop, but this is kind of the successor talk to the talk that we did last year at Spring I/O. So the talk we did last year at Spring I/O is kind of the intro to observability, basics of observability. And I mean, we cover a lot there, but it's kind of talking about mostly the stuff that you get out of the box. And so this is where we want to kind of dig into, okay, I understand what I get out of the box. That's all very helpful, but we have our own business logic there, and we want to instrument our business logic, or we have some library that we use that isn't open source, and so we want to instrument that library. This is for those people who want to, or if you're not even one of those people and you just want to understand more of how the instrumentation is done under the covers in all of the projects that you're using, this is for those people. So we're going to talk about the observation API, which is the thing that's doing the instrumentation.
Awesome.
Yeah, so there are some intersections, but yeah, it can be shocking that like even an 8 hours workshop is not enough to cover everything.
Yeah.
And yeah, like that workshop can be like multiple days. For the record, I'm not volunteering for anything right now.
You don't want to do multiple day workshops. Yeah, that's a lot. Cool. Anything else you want to kind of tease or give people anything they might learn if they come to the session or the workshop that we kind of haven't talked about today? Or I think, have we covered it all?
Like come to the workshop and come to the session. Like both will have like a very, very like interesting thing that we will demo. And also the session, it should have a surprise at the end, I guess. Hopefully we will be able to make it.
There we go. A little tease. I like it.
And whether you come to either, if you're at Spring.io and you're watching this, feel free to come and talk to us, chat with us, tell us what you're doing observability related. Let us know if you have any questions, any feedback. We'd love to, we're always looking for more feedback, and we want to make sure that we're focusing on what's most useful for our users.
Yeah, don't be shy. Say hi, talk some observability. The hallway tracks are always the best part of any conference. So get there, start talking to everyone. And usually just a small question leads into some like really interesting discussion. So should be fun. Okay. With that, we have a few minutes left. I want to turn our attention to kind of Spring Boot 3.3. If you have some questions on anything we kind of talked about, please get them in the chat. As I mentioned at the beginning of the show, there are a bunch of release notes on 3.3. We are going to have a release on Thursday, which will kind of aggregate a lot of these release notes from the different milestones and release candidates. But sometimes I look at these release notes and I'm like, okay, that kind of makes sense, but I'm not sure exactly what that change is. So I figured we'd pick out a couple of these and talk about them. So one thing I will notice is I went through, so there's like milestone 1, milestone 2, milestone 3, and an RC1. And I was like, let me go through and see which ones have observability changes in them. Guess what? All 4 of those release notes have observability changes in them. So as you said, you're constantly making improvements to different things with observability. So one of the things I highlighted here in this one was we have support for micrometers at span tag. This has been added. Can either of you kind of talk to that, what that span tag is and why we might want to use it?
Mm-hmm. So this is basically just like an annotation that you can use mostly in your methods parameters. And when you do that, and there is a new span or continuous span annotation on that method, then those parameters will be added to the span as tags. So you can basically like configure with that single annotation the metadata that goes to the span. You can do this with manually, like get the current span and just tag it. This is the annotation way of doing the same thing.
Cool. We talked about this earlier, but added a process info contributor, which can be enabled with management.info process.enabled equals true. Okay, cool. So there's that. So we have in the 3.3.0 milestone 2 release notes, we have Jersey observability. So Micrometer 1.1.3 has deprecated its Jersey support in favor of Jersey's micrometer module. Is that just like a kind of like a dependency change?
So this is similar to what we did with Spring Boot 3.0, where we moved the instrumentation closer to the project. So previously we had instrumentation for Jersey in Micrometer itself, And this was moving that instrumentation to the Jersey project. And so they have a module that's called Jersey Micrometer that now has that instrumentation, and it's instrumented with the observation API. So you get metrics and tracing out of the box with that. So yeah, this is just more of that moving instrumentation closer to the projects.
Yeah, and I guess this is a very important thing to us to move that closer to the project.
Yeah.
So if you are a maintainer and you want instrumentation, let us know. We are here to help. If you are a user of a framework and a library and they don't have instrumentation for Micrometer, like open an issue for that library and framework, and we are there to help.
Cool. Yeah, I'm looking at the Milestone 3 release notes, and it kind of reminded me of seeing like the flyway change, right? Like we had this one like flyway dependency, and now we've kind of broken that out into different dependencies for like the different vendors. And yeah, that's really cool. Okay, so in the Milestone 3 release notes, I'm looking at some changes to Prometheus. For anybody who's out there who just like hears these different terms and these different libraries, can you just talk about what Prometheus is and how it kind of falls into observability?
Yeah, so Prometheus is a very popular open source metrics backend. So it has an open source metrics backend that you can run. It defines a metrics format. It has a minimal UI, but it also integrates with other UIs, like you can visualize your metrics in Grafana from Prometheus. So the idea is that if your application is producing metrics, you need somewhere to store those long-term so that you can query them, so that you can generate alerts based off of them. You can make dashboards based off of them. But Prometheus is primarily the component of receiving those metrics and storing them long-term and then querying them.
But we don't do, so we wouldn't create our like dashboards. You create dashboards and alerts in something else like Grafana?
Grafana is the most popular open source solution for dashboards and graphing, and they now do alerts, and they're integrating with more and more things these days. Cool.
So even if I was, we talked about like getting started without actually getting started. If I included something like the Spring Boot actuator, and I configured something like Prometheus, even if I wasn't creating dashboards or alerts, that's probably a really good place to start. And I can visit that later as we start to like look at those needs, right?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. I think getting the data first is an important first step, and then you can start to, as you start figuring out what your needs are. I mean, it's best to define your needs up front if you can, but
for sure,
you know,
it's good to write tests first too, Tommy, but nobody does. I get it.
Yeah, but by the way, that is one of the goals of that T-House like project. It will give you like a pre-configured like Prometheus and Grafana like servers, so that you can play with that if you want with existing applications. But if you want to use those for your app, you can just like start the Prometheus and the Grafana part, and everything will be basically the same.
And I love that. That's why I point people that, because I think like, I don't know how it is for you guys, because you guys are like kind of in the trenches with a lot of these tools, but as just a sometime user of some of these tools, I think it is a little overwhelming. There's all these different like backends, there's all these different tools to like visualize data, and you're always like, well, which one of these do I need? Like, which one of these should I use? Like, do I need all of these? Like, that can be a little bit overwhelming because there's just so many options out there. So yeah, that's one of the reasons I point people to that T-House example, is like, yeah, you have everything configured, and here are some like really good examples of how to use those. So the Prometheus metrics change here, it looks just like a different dependency. Is that all I'm seeing here? Micrometer registry, Prometheus simple client.
That was a big change in Micrometer. So the story behind it is, after like 9 years, Prometheus released 1.0. It was on 0.x for a while, and I believe right now, like they just released 1.3 like last week. So this
is for the Prometheus Java client specifically.
Yes.
Prometheus
Sorry, this
server,
is
the backend has been 1.x for a long time.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yes, this is only for the Java client. And
Okay.
so we have a registry called Micrometer Registry Prometheus to support that. And it used to use like 0.x, but now it is using 1.x. So if you strictly look at this is a breaking change because we are using now a client which brings in breaking changes. But on the other hand, when you like modify the version number, like migrating from Micrometer 1.12 to 1.13, and you don't want to have these breaking changes and you want to migrate, and you don't want to migrate to the new Prometheus client, you can like stay at the old one using the Micrometer Registry Prometheus simple client. So yeah,
Gotcha.
you need to change the dependency if you don't want to migrate, but if you want to, then don't change it and just do the migration. We have a document that like basically like drives through all of the migration steps that you might need to make, and it is not very hard to do.
Cool. I do have a question here. Hi, thanks for the interesting afternoon. Question: if I want to know how long action takes that also contains DB steps, can I see how long the DB call to is in the correlation of overall time?
So the short answer is absolutely, but the longer answer is you need to make sure that the part of your application that's calling the database is also instrumented for observability. So we do have a project for that if you're using like JDBC, for example. And I think a number of the drivers as well, R2DBC also has instrumentation available. So as long as you're using something that has that has Micrometer observability instrumentation built into it, then yes, you will be able to see that both in the metrics and the tracing data that's available. And from the tracing data, you'll be able to see the breakdown of here's how much time was spent overall in the application. Here's the portion of that time that was spent making the database call.
So this is built in for R2DBC. And if you are using JDBC, then you can go either to the T-House repo or to the Spring Framework documentation, maybe Boot as well. And there is a Micrometer samples repo as well. All of these contain that project. It is called JDBC Observations by our friend Tadaya. He basically wrote that.
Yeah, and I did a video on that a long time ago. So if you look on the YouTube channel, I did a video on that project.
Cool.
So go ahead and check that out. This is also where distributed tracing comes in a lot, right? Like, hey, I have this action that is going to maybe call a service, call another service, then write some information to a database. And like, I want to see where the bottleneck is in that whole kind of chain. So without distributed tracing, that's kind of a mystery, right?
Yeah, I think that was kind of the prototypical reason for distributed tracing being introduced in a lot of places, was to be able to pinpoint that latency bottleneck.
Yep.
Again, if you have all of these different applications and you want to figure out why was this request slow, I mean, the answer, it could be multiple reasons, but if you have everything included in your tracing data, then it's very easy to quickly visualize it and see here's how much time is being taken at each place. And then if you correlate that with the metrics, then you can also see very easily, is the time that it took there abnormally long or not? You can also compare two different traces, like one trace that you know was fast, one trace that was slow, and then see what is the difference, where's the time difference happening.
Cool. One more question / comment here. Can we improve on the examples around web flux and observability, especially when using Kotlin coroutines? It seems that the observability team focused firstly on web, ignoring the reactive. I don't know that that's the case.
So I guess like this is a little bit of a loaded question, and the short answer to this is yes. Especially if you open an issue and explain us what you need or a pull request.
Perfect. Yeah.
We do have a samples repo called Micrometer-samples, where you can find webflux like samples as well. And I believe it is kind of true that we firstly focus on web, not necessarily on reactive and webflux, because that model is much more complicated. So if you want, and most of the people, I think that they are still using MVC. So usually when we talk about observability concepts with a web endpoint, that is most of the time is MVC or with MVC. For example, the T-House repo is not using Reactor. And this is the reason, because most of the people are still using MVC, and with Webflux, things are a little bit more complicated. But we do have samples for Webflux. Not for Kotlin coroutines, I guess. But if there is something missing, yeah, open an issue, open a pull request, and yeah, we are happy to look at it.
Cool. Another one. Thanks. Hope to see you in Spring IO next week and talk more about observability. Yes, that'll be fun.
Deal.
Cool.
Looking forward to it.
Yep.
All right. I think with that, we are running up against time. So outside of being at Spring IO next week and getting a chance to talk to everyone about observability, where can we find out more about you, learn more about some of the stuff we talked about today? I'll start with you, Jonatan.
If you want to learn more about these things, I would start with the documentation.
Yeah.
I just go to Micrometer IO and look at the docs. It can help a lot. It explains most of these concepts. If you feel that you are an expert, you can go to the code as well, and you can also contribute if you want. And I believe other than that, you can also search around YouTube about observability talks. Dan, as far as I remember, you did one a while ago, and also some of the talks that we did in the past. It is also online.
Yep, check out that Spring IO talk from Tommy last year. That was in March, so that's a good place to start. How about you, Tommy? Where can we learn more about you?
I don't do social media very much these days, but I do try to keep up with if you have questions related to Micrometer, you can find both of us on the Micrometer Slack. So there's a Slack awesome. There for questions from the community. And other than that, I mean, if you have issues, if you have feature requests, of course, GitHub issues for sure. And I will also reiterate checking the documentation, because we did just not that long ago, I think 6 months ago is when we launched the new documentation. So across the Spring portfolio, we've been kind of updating our documentation to use a new engine. And so now all of the docs are much more easily searchable. So I think that's a great feature if you are trying to look for a specific thing, and should be easier to find.
And I think that's a great point. You know, we always talk on this show, the first place to look are the documentation, the Spring Framework documentation, Spring Boot documentation. There's a lot of good information in there on observability, but it is important to note that Micrometer is kind of its own project, right? It's not, you'll find stuff about observability in the Spring Framework docs, but a really great resource is the Micrometer documentation. So in correlation with the Spring Framework docs, that is a really good place to start. And I always push people to the docs, because you can go search for something and it may be out of, probably something that is not current, some answer out there on Google or Stack Overflow. So documentation, really great place to start.
Well, if anyone's looking to get started with contributing to the project and you don't feel confident contributing to code, then please take a look at the docs. If there's something in there that is confusing or you think could be done better, or you have any suggestions for the docs, we would love to get contributions to the docs as well as code. So that's always welcome.
That's how I started. That was my first contribution to Micrometer, 2 characters in the documentation years ago, years before I joined the Spring team.
We have so many stories like that around the Spring team. We've talked to Spencer about that. He had a similar story. I made just a small contribution, and next thing you know, he's here for 11 years now or whatever. So a really great place to start is just going through the documentation. And as somebody who's new to the project, you get this different angle that you guys don't have, because you're deep in the trenches every day. So just being able to say, I didn't really understand this, or this didn't work for my particular scenario. So read the docs, use the project, just filing an issue or saying, here's an issue of something that I didn't understand in the docs. Really great place to start.
And
So,
even if you don't
Jonah-
have an issue, we love to hear how you're using things, what's
Yes.
successful for you,
Oh,
what was really helpful. Like, because again, we always want to know like where should we be spending our effort? Because there's so
Right.
many different directions we could be going in, and we want to make sure that we're doing the most for the community. So helping us drive the direction is always welcome.
Yep. Cool. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. I know it was odd hours for everyone, so I appreciate your time. And I am really looking forward to next week, Spring IO. Looking forward to seeing both of you. So safe travels, and I will see you both at Spring IO. And until then, we will have I'm pretty sure we have a couple episodes coming up next week, one on Spring Boot 3.3. And we will be doing a live Spring office hours from the booth at Spring IO. So that should be a lot of fun as well. So with that, again, thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. And we will see you in the next one.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.